Imagine a quiet evening with nothing to portend trouble. A little black girl stands on the doorstep of a house, her eyes full of tears and her heart squeezed with fear. She has just experienced humiliation and pain at the hands of a woman who didn't even try to understand her, just threw her out, hurled insulting words, and slammed the door shut. But something unexpected lies ahead of her, something that will set things right and reverberate through each of them. And yes, this woman would find out who she was messing with. Before we go any further, friends, write in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. You have no idea how important your feedback and your presence is to us. Each of your likes, comments, and subscriptions help promote our channel and give us the strength and motivation to create new stories. Thank you for being with us. Without you, this channel would not exist. It was dusk when a short black girl appeared on the porch of a small but well-maintained house. Her clothes were simple but clean, and in her hands she clutched a shabby toy that might once have been bright and new. The girl looked scared and alone, but gathering all her courage, she knocked on the heavy oak door in front of her. A moment later, the door opened abruptly, and a tall woman appeared on the threshold. She was dressed in a strict suit. Her hair was impeccably styled, and her gaze was cold and wary. As soon as she looked at the girl, she pressed her lips together as if she were not a child, but dirt that had accidentally fallen on her doorstep. The woman gave her a long, disparaging stare, and the girl felt it piercing her, as if judging and rejecting her simply because she was not like the woman in front of her. To the woman, every element of the girl's appearance seemed unacceptable. Her dark skin, her curly hair, the large eyes that peered anxiously into her face. The woman stood with her arms folded across her chest, defiantly not making the slightest gesture to invite the girl inside or even ask why she had come. She had known from the beginning that uninvited guests, especially uninvited guests like this, could do no good. "What do you want here?" she said coldly and contemptuously, squinting her eyes. "Are you lost?" Her voice sounded with such obvious dislike that the girl involuntarily pressed herself against the wall of the house, barely daring to look up at the woman. She was too young to fully understand the contempt implicit in those words, but she instinctively sensed the disgust and hatred coming from the stranger. "I'm sorry. I need help," the girl said with difficulty, her voice trembling with fear. These words only increased the woman's irritation. Her gaze became even more hostile, and she stepped back a little as if fearing that the girl would infect her with her presence. She saw this child as nothing more than a stranger who had invaded her immaculate, well-kept world. Her thoughts were filled with stereotypes and prejudices. She didn't see a little person in front of her who needed help. All she saw was a black girl who she thought should have been kept out of her home, her life, and even her street. "Help?" she said with an icy grin. "Don't you have your own places to help? Or maybe you just thought you could come here and get something?" For her, the girl was a symbol of everything foreign and inappropriate in her world. It was as if her presence on the doorstep cast a shadow over her respectable home, and the woman, blinded by her racist prejudices, was ready to do anything to get rid of this threat as soon as possible. The woman stood on the threshold, looking down at the girl with contempt, as if she were not a human being but something low and unworthy of her attention. Her gaze was hard, and in every shade of it there was condemnation. Everything about this girl irritated her, from her dark skin to her modest, almost lost appearance, from her frightened eyes to her plain worn dress, which had hardly ever been new. To her, it all symbolized the foreignness, the dirt, the chaos that had no place near her home, her life of austerity, order, and well-being. Her mind was instantly filled with the stereotypes and beliefs she had been sure of since childhood. The girl's black skin seemed not just different to her, but some kind of symbol of threat, a symbol of disorder and an alien world she wanted nothing to do with and had no intention of having anything to do with. Where do they come from? She mentally fretted, finding confirmation of her deep-seated prejudices. Her thoughts hovered around a set of derogatory stereotypes from which the woman had never tried to free herself. Her gaze, heavy and detached, seemed to say to the girl, "You are not of our circle, not of our life. You are a mistake, a misunderstanding, disturbing the peace of my ideal world." The woman was proud of her origin, her status, and before her stood someone who, in her opinion, was absolutely unworthy of it. With contempt and coldness, barely containing her obvious disgust, she looked at the girl as the embodiment of everything she thought was worth keeping away from respectable people. "And who are you trying to sympathize with here?" Her voice became quieter, almost hissing. She looked at the girl with a smirk so dismissive that she shrank back. "You think I'd let you anywhere near my house? You'd better know your place and stay away." She said those words with such smug confidence that she didn't even think about the consequences. She had been raised in a world where everyone had a place, and this girl, in her opinion, was trespassing into territory she wasn't allowed to enter. Her whole gut rebelled against this invasion, and her deep-seated racism was her excuse for her cruelty and neglect. She felt a kind of angry satisfaction stirring inside her, and with each word her condemnation only grew stronger. The girl looked up at her with a mixture of fear and pleading, but the woman saw neither pleading nor childish helplessness in those eyes. To her it was just a blank stare, devoid of meaning or value. Her prejudice had blinded her to the fact that she saw only the symbol she hated in front of her. The girl took a deep breath, gathering her wits, and said quietly, "Please, I need help." Those words, spoken in an uncertain, timid voice, only served to inflame the woman's hatred more. She squinted, her face contorted in a cruel expression, as if asking for help from this child was not just unacceptable, but disgusting, something impertinent that the woman took as a personal insult. Her eyes flashed with cold fire, and she could barely contain the anger that burst forth. "Help?" Her voice came out with a sharp, sharp sneer, every syllable soaked in contempt. "You really think someone like me would want to help someone like you? Someone like you? I don't know what you're doing here, but you better get out of here, and the sooner the better." She took a sharp step toward the girl, showing aggression, and the girl instinctively backed away, clutching the toy to her chest as if it were the only defense against the torrents of hatred the woman was hurling at her. But she only seemed to grow angrier at this gesture of helplessness. Her eyes reflected contempt, turning to outright disgust. "You think standing on my doorstep and playing the victim is going to make a difference?" The woman continued, her voice growing harsher and harsher, almost shouting. "Believe me, it won't help you. You always feel that someone owes you something, that you must be pitied and saved, as if you have the right to demand anything here in my house. Remember, girl, this is not for people like you." Her words pierced the girl. Each of them was like a blow. She didn't understand the full force of the hatred directed at her, but she intuitively felt that the woman saw her not just as a child, but as an object on which to pour all her venom and prejudice. The woman looked at her with contempt, as if she were something insignificant, unworthy of even the slightest help. "I just need a place to sleep." The girl could barely hold back her tears, but tried with her last strength to appeal to the mercy that wasn't in this woman. "To spend the night?" she exclaimed with a sneer. "Do you think this is a shelter? Or do you think I'm going to help anyone who wants to barge in here? How you all love it." She twisted her lips into a contemptuous smirk, her words oozing venom. You think you can just complain and cry and everyone will rush to your aid? Well, no, not this time. You don't belong here. Get out before I call the police. You think they'll be happy to see you there? Those words were the last straw. The woman raised her hand, pointing to the sidewalk, as if pushing the girl out, not even physically, but with the force of her hatred and arrogance. Her cold voice was full of threat, and the girl realized that any attempt to resist would be futile. The woman didn't just reject the girl, she unleashed an avalanche of contemptuous, venomous words, each one hateful. Her voice became more and more venomous, as if each phrase was carefully crafted to hurt, to destroy any sense of dignity the girl might have felt. You don't get it, do you?" the woman hissed, looking her over from head to toe in disgust. "You're an unwanted guest here, a worthless beggar, standing on the doorstep of a house you can't get into. With looks like that, with skin like yours, do you think anyone would give you a place here? You should know your place, and that place is not here, at my house." The girl froze. Tears slowly began to well up in her eyes. She did not understand why she was so humiliated, but she felt that there was no escape from this aggression. The woman seemed to rise above her, leaving no chance for mercy or understanding. "Why do you even think you have the right to knock on people like me?" the woman continued, her voice almost a venomous whisper. "It's always the same with you. You think the world is unfair to you, that everyone owes you something. But you know what? That's not here. Here are people with dignity, with history, with rules. You have no idea how much effort it takes to build a life of cleanliness and order, where there is no room for people like you, who only know how to spoil, dirty, destroy." Those words fell on the girl like icy drops, shattering her heart. She felt even more helpless, feeling her hope dissolve with each phrase, as if melted by the poison in that voice. "Don't you understand? You're not wanted here, not by anyone." The woman's voice became quieter, but even more ominous. "People like you belong far away from here, among people like you. Maybe somewhere on the street, in the shadows, where you wouldn't be conspicuous and spoil the picture of the normal world." The girl could hardly contain herself from bursting into tears on the doorstep. She felt like an insignificant person, a person who didn't even have the right to ask for help. These words cut her from the inside, destroying any remnants of faith in the kindness of people. She wanted to leave, but her legs wouldn't listen, as if roots had taken root at the very threshold of that door, chaining her to the place, to this humiliation and hatred. "Look at you." The woman cast a scornful glance at the old toy she clutched in her hands. "Pathetic, clinging to a rag as if it would do you any good. No one is interested in your pleading. No one will waste time on you. Are you so stupid that you think anyone would want to shelter you?" The last phrase fell like a stone, and the girl realized that her hopes were shattered completely. She felt alien, unwanted, and lonely, no longer seeing any salvation near this house, in the eyes of this woman, in this city. The girl stood on the cold porch steps, her little shoulders shaking. Until that moment, she had believed that there was a place in the world where she would be accepted and helped. But every word, every humiliating remark of that woman had cut her like sharp knives and left nothing but smoldering fear and pain in her heart. She felt something fragile and important inside her crumble, as if her small inner world could no longer withstand this ruthless aggression. Her lips quivered, and tears came to her eyes, heavy, hot, but held back, as if she were ashamed of even these simple expressions of weakness. She stood stubbornly on the threshold, clutching the old toy, her only comfort, but she could no longer hide how much the woman's words hurt her, how much she was hurt. The first heavy tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another. She lowered her head, as if trying to hide from the cold, unforgiving gaze of the woman who watched her tears with obvious satisfaction. In every word of this woman was heard the desire to break her, to humiliate her, to make her feel insignificant and unnecessary, and the girl, trembling with fear and embarrassment, really began to feel that way. The words echoed over and over in her head. No one needs you. You don't deserve help. Not so long ago, she had thought that kind people were everywhere, that anyone who saw her asking for help would feel a little pity for her. But standing in front of this woman, exuding hatred, the girl suddenly realized that perhaps she was wrong. The small, confused heart shrank with shame, disappointment, and loneliness. Fear of the woman and her angry words mingled with a heavy sense of her own worthlessness and despair. She felt so humiliated and helpless for the first time in her life. Her eyes, which a second ago had been full of hope, faded and sank to the floor, avoiding the woman's cold, merciless gaze. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet marks on her dark skin, but she dared not even raise a hand to wipe them away, afraid to show how badly she had been hurt. The woman looked at the girl with growing irritation. Her angry satisfaction at the way the girl trembled and cried was quickly replaced by annoyance. The tears and the child's distressed look no longer gave her any satisfaction. Now, she just wanted this alien little silhouette to disappear so that it would no longer stain her doorstep with its presence. The woman grabbed her by the shoulder, her fingers digging painfully into her thin skin, and without ceremony, she yanked her roughly toward her. The girl, stunned and frightened, had only time to sob when she was dragged sharply to the edge of the porch. "I told you to get out of here," the woman hissed, her voice low, almost animalistic with rage. "You have no right to stand in this place, in this house. How dare you even show up here?" She pushed the girl harder, with such force that she barely kept her footing, tripping over the step. The girl felt the ground go out from under her feet, and she lost her balance and almost fell, but managed to grab the edge of the railing. But the woman was adamant. Her eyes were lightning bolts of pity, and without giving the child a moment's respite, she pushed her again, this time with even greater rudeness. "You think anyone's gonna care about you? You're just a burden, you know? A burden, not even worthy of standing on the doorstep, much less asking for help," she continued, as if trying to erase the last crumbs of hope and strength from the small body in front of her. This time the girl couldn't help herself. She stumbled and fell to her knees on the gravel beside the path. Her knees were instantly scraped, sharp pebbles dug into her skin, and she barely held back a scream. But the woman paid no attention, only looked at her with an expression of utter contempt and disgust, as if she were not a child but something filthy, not worthy of even a glance. "And I don't want to see you here again," she said like a sentence. "You're not coming back here, never." The girl lay on the cold ground, feeling the sharp stones digging into her knees and palms. The pain was sharp, but even stronger was the sense of humiliation and fear that overtook her. She didn't understand what she had done wrong, why this woman hated her so much. Earlier, she had believed that if something bad happened, it was for a just cause, people helping those in need, showing kindness as her parents had taught her. But now, when her knees ached and her soul was empty, it seemed to her that all those words about kindness and justice were lies. Sitting on the ground, the girl tried to realize what she could have done to make this woman so angry. Why had her simple request for help provoked such a storm of hatred? Her heart clenched with fear, and the thought that kept coming to her mind became more and more frightening. Maybe the world was not what she had imagined it to be. Maybe there was no room for those who didn't fit into other people's ideas of what the right people should look or act like. Perhaps this was her first real lesson in how cruel and unfair the world could be, and the thought made her feel cold and lonely, even scarier than the pain that coursed through her shattered knees. She looked at the house she had just been kicked out of, at the locked door behind which was a woman radiating something dark and hostile, and a fear grew in her small heart that the rest of the world might be the same. She gingerly touched her skinned knees and felt the sharp pain again. Droplets of blood and dust remained on her hands. It was the first time she'd ever experienced anything like this. Pain not from an accidental fall, not from playing with friends where bruises were part of the fun, but from the deliberate cruelty of an adult. The woman didn't just kick her out, she did it with hatred and malice, as if the girl wasn't a person, but some kind of threat that shouldn't be on her property. This fear of adults, whom she had once perceived as protectors, was now firmly rooted in her mind. Why? Why did she do this to me? The thoughts jumbled in her head, and everything seemed so incomprehensible and horrible to her. Could people really be like that? After all, she didn't even know this woman, and she hadn't demanded anything from her, only help. What could she have done to make her so angry? These questions were thorns in her mind, making her feel all alone and alien in the world. She gingerly touched her skinned knees and felt the sharp pain again. Droplets of blood and dust remained on her hands. It was the first time she'd ever experienced anything like this. Pain not from an accidental fall, not from playing with friends where bruises were part of the fun, but from the deliberate cruelty of an adult. The woman didn't just kick her out, she did it with hatred and malice, as if the girl wasn't a person, but some kind of threat that shouldn't be on her property. This fear of adults, whom she had once perceived as protectors, was now firmly rooted in her mind. Why? Why did she do this to me? The thoughts jumbled in her head, and everything seemed so incomprehensible and horrible to her. Could people really be like that? After all, she didn't even know this woman, and she hadn't demanded anything from her, only help. What could she have done to make her so angry? These questions were thorns in her mind, making her feel all alone and alien in the world. She remembered her mother telling her that people will always help if you ask them kindly. There was a warm faith in people in her heart, in the fact that kindness is the most important thing that everyone carries within them. But here, on this stranger's porch, in this empty, cold place, she faced a reality that was very different. This woman, her evil eyes, her harsh words, her indifference to the girl's pain, all of it shattered her belief that the world could be kind. The little girl could not understand why they had done this to her. She remembered again the hateful words repeating in her head like an ominous echo. "No one wants you. Get out. You don't belong here." Those words didn't just hurt her. They began to seem like the truth, a horrible and inescapable truth. Sitting on the cold ground, she felt her fear of this world grow with each passing moment, consuming her thoughts and hopes. She was afraid to get up, afraid to go anywhere else because she didn't know where she would be accepted and understood. Was it just a coincidence that she had stumbled upon such a person? Or was the whole world like that? She couldn't decide, but fear was already lodged firmly in her soul. She was afraid to even take a step, because it seemed that every new house, every next door would be just as cold, with someone else standing behind it, looking at her with contempt and hatred. "Do I really not belong here?" she thought, struggling to suppress her tears. She clutched her toy to her chest as if it were her last link to a world where she was loved, where she was valued. When night fell, the city was shrouded in a gloomy, cold gloom. The girl sitting on the side of the road felt the world around her change. The sounds faded, the daylight faded away, leaving her in darkness. Finding herself alone, without a single familiar soul by her side, she began to realize that the worst night of her life was ahead of her. She didn't know where to go, and the thought of spending the night here, right on the street, gave her a terror she had never felt before. Sitting under a tree by the curb, the girl hugged her knees, cradling her toy as if it were her only protector from the encroaching darkness. She could hear rustles all around her, each one sounding frighteningly loud. Streetlights flickered in the distance, but they seemed inaccessible, as if they were in some other world that was not for her. Her little heart pounded frantically, every sound making her flinch. She was surrounded by a world that was suddenly cold and hostile. Fear crawled into her mind, slowly but inexorably. In the darkness before her eyes, images that would not let her rest. The faces of people like that woman, full of hatred and contempt, rose before her, giving her no chance for comfort. She tried to close her eyes, trying to distract herself, but every time her eyelids closed, the cold gaze and evil face would reappear before her mind, as if her appearance would only make people feel contempt and disgust. Her small, skinned knees and arms ached, but there was an even greater pain in her soul, a pain that even physical pain could not take away. A deep sense of loneliness enveloped her. Suddenly, she was scared to the point of trembling. It seemed to her that she would be alone forever, that no one would ever come to help her. She felt more and more the emptiness and despair dragging her down, the cold of the night penetrating her skin, leaving her completely helpless. Soon even her own thoughts began to frighten her. What if no one ever wants to help me? Flashed through her mind. If every person looks at me the way that woman did? The thought was unbearable for her. She thought of her parents, the warmth of their home, the care she was used to. It all seemed so distant to her now, as if it was happening in another life. Even the memories of home were too painful, for they reminded her of how different she was from this strange, cold city and its people. Every rustle and sound of the night seemed a threat. A gust of wind made her flinch, and passing cars cast long shadows on the road that seemed to stretch toward her like something ominous and inevitable. She tried to close her eyes and hold the toy tighter, but her imagination kept throwing up images of the dangers lurking in the darkness. There were hardly any passers-by, which made it all the more frightening. She felt that no one would see her here. No one would understand her suffering. No one would pay attention to her lonely, small figure. She realized for the first time how helpless and insignificant she was in front of the world, and the thought was frightening, paralyzing. She felt tiny, lost in a vast, cold world that neither saw nor knew her pain. For hours she sat on the cold ground, curled up, trying to keep warm. But the night grew colder and colder, and the loneliness grew worse. She had nowhere to go, no one to confide in. Her childlike mind was unable to cope with such fear and hopelessness. She was tired to the point of exhaustion, but she couldn't sleep. Fear wouldn't let her close her eyes, and her body shuddered with cold and fear, giving her no rest. Finally, by dawn, she dropped her head to her knees, so exhausted that her eyes closed of their own accord. For a moment her thoughts were silent, and the darkness was replaced by a restless, intermittent sleep. But even in her sleep, the images of night, of rejection, of misunderstanding did not leave her. Her small figure sitting alone under a tree seemed lost in a vast world where everyone was her enemy. The woman returned to her cozy home and closed the door behind her, as if cutting herself off from anything she thought might spoil her perfectly arranged world. She walked down the clean, neatly furnished hallway, enjoying the silence and order that reigned around her. Her steps were unhurried, and a strange satisfaction glowed in her eyes. There was not the slightest doubt or remorse in her soul. On the contrary, she felt deeply smug and even proud of her actions. At last, that girl is gone, she thought with contempt, remembering how she had trembled and wept on her doorstep. Her imagination, as if not satisfied with the pain she had inflicted on the girl, painted scenes of her despair and terror, which, strange to say, brought her a sense of triumph. She imagined how the tiny figure she was pushing out into the cold would wander in the dark, lost and frightened, and this picture only increased her complacency. It seemed to her that she had not merely thrown the child out, but had proved something, had defended her principles, her convictions, her belief that everyone should know his place. Sitting down in her favorite chair by the window, the woman looked around. Everything in her house was perfect, from the luxurious curtains to the shiny glass vases on the shelves. To her, this neatness and cleanliness was a symbol of her status, her impeccability. She believed that this order should be observed in her surroundings as well, and people like that girl should not be part of her world. They don't belong with us, she thought, feeling her disdain grow into something akin to pride in making the right choice. How dare they even show up here, she muttered to herself, as if reasoning with an invisible interlocutor who would surely approve of her opinion. People like her, they're used to being owed something. They think they can just come and knock and get help, as if we self-respecting people have an obligation to stoop to their level. These thoughts seemed absolutely correct and logical to her. They sounded in her head like axioms, confirming her cruel and humiliating attitude. She was sure that her behavior was not cruelty, but a manifestation of firmness and principle. If no one shows them where they belong, they'll keep sticking their noses where they're not welcome, she reasoned, imagining that she was just a voice of reason and order in a world full of chaos and inappropriate people. She felt herself to be something of a guardian of her own way of life, and if she had to be tough, well, that was the way it had to be. The woman convinced herself that she had done the right thing by being so cold and cruel, that her act was an act of defense of her own world against outsiders who didn't understand where they belonged. And if anyone got hurt because of it, it was not her concern. Her thoughts went back to the moment when she had pushed the girl over the threshold, as if she were pushing out something dirty and unnecessary rather than a living person. She remembered her tears, her plea for help, and instead of feeling sympathy for even a moment, she felt only contempt and even some schadenfreude. Let her realize now that she doesn't belong here, she thought, her gaze cold and indifferent, as if she enjoyed imagining the girl's suffering. Her indifference to the consequences of this act was absolute. The woman did not think about where the child might be now, how she would spend the night on the street, whether she would be safe. She cared only about her own peace and the purity of her life, and everything else seemed insignificant, not having the slightest relation to her own reality. After all, to her, that girl was just part of the problem, part of a world she was happy to isolate herself from in her home, which was filled with silence, cleanliness, and tranquility. The woman closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, satisfied with herself. She had no doubts, no thoughts of cruelty or justice. She felt victorious, confident that she had made the right choice. Her smug smile was the final touch of this cruel and indifferent picture. Thus, in silence and full assurance of her rightness, she spent the rest of the evening unaware that her cruel deeds, like an ominous shadow, would soon catch up with her. The next day, after the cold and brutal night the girl had spent outside, the woman began her morning ritual. She drank freshly brewed coffee as usual, enjoying the sunlight that gently filtered through the window curtains of her living room. Her day began in a measured manner, in the atmosphere of order and cleanliness to which she was so accustomed. Everything seemed as it should be. She recalled with a slight satisfaction the events of the previous evening, when she had so decisively put the stranger in her place. It had been a victory of sorts for her, proof that she was in control of her life and surroundings, that she could organize her world as she saw fit. But suddenly, the doorbell rang loudly and insistently. It was strange, for she rarely received visitors, especially unannounced. Her peaceful morning seemed to have been disturbed by something that would disrupt her routine. Irritated and slightly wary, she set aside her cup of coffee, stood up and, with a strained smile, went to the door, preparing herself for any surprise. When she opened the door, she saw a man dressed in a strict business suit, his gaze serious and his face impenetrable. "Good morning. I apologize for the early visit, but I have something to do with you," he said coldly, raising his head slightly as if to show his superiority. The woman barely concealed her irritation, but in an effort to maintain decorum, she replied dryly, "What can I do for you?" The man called himself a lawyer, and her wariness was instantly heightened. Why had the lawyer come to her, and what could he possibly want? She could not understand what he had to do with her and her life. The lawyer, realizing her perplexity, only calmly continued, "I'm here on a case involving a girl. I'm sure you've seen her." When she heard this, the woman frowned. She was immediately disgusted, remembering the girl who had stood on her doorstep the day before, her hands trembling and her eyes pleading for help. Her smug expression was gradually replaced by wariness. She hadn't expected that the girl's story would continue. "Yes, there was a case," she admitted, crossing her arms and looking at the lawyer with cold interest. "But I don't see why it should interest you." The man held her gaze and, continuing to maintain an impenetrable expression, said, "This girl you speak of, her father is a man you probably know well." The woman was even more wary, her face becoming tense, but she tried to keep her expression cold, not letting him notice her anxiety. "You must be mistaken," she said, already losing her composure. "I don't know her father, and I'm not going to interfere in their affairs." But the lawyer only glared at her and added with inexorable firmness, "I don't think there's been a mistake. The girl's father is your ex-husband, Mr. Barkley. Is that a name you might know?" The word struck her like a thunderclap. In an instant, her face turned pale, her gaze seemed to freeze, and the air became heavy and cold. Her ex-husband, the father of that particular girl? She stared at the lawyer, unable to believe what she was hearing, feeling her confidence and smugness begin to crumble under the weight of this overwhelming truth. She saw the image of the girl again, her big, frightened eyes, her restrained tears, her humiliated look. And suddenly, it all took on a completely different meaning. "This can't be," she whispered, losing what remained of the firmness in her voice. "There must be some mistake. Why wasn't I told?" Her voice sounded helpless, as if she were speaking not to the lawyer but to herself, unable to accept the reality that was shattering everything she knew and believed. Her confidence, the sense of superiority she had felt only hours ago, vanished, replaced by anxiety and fear. She realized that she hadn't just kicked out someone else's child. She had kicked out a girl whose fate was inextricably linked to her own life, to her past, to the man she had once loved. "Mr. Barkley has recently learned of his daughter's existence," the lawyer continued, not noticing or paying attention to her shock. "He wants to right the wrongs and take care of her. He has decided to leave her a portion of the inheritance and intends to take her into his home. But yesterday's incident, it shook her, and I don't wonder why." Every word he said hit her like a stone, leaving painful marks. She realized that her indifference, her coldness and cruelty were now having consequences. Now the images came to her mind. The girl, frozen and frightened, alone in the street, her face full of tears and pain. She had thrown her out without giving her a chance for help, unaware that on her doorstep stood a child connected to her own destiny, that this child was part of her life, though she did not realize it. Her world began to crack at the seams. She could feel the familiar structure of her life crumbling, her beliefs beginning to weaken under the pressure of this new truth. Everything that had seemed right and fair to her became a lie in an instant, an illusion she had created to separate herself from the world, from people who, as it turned out, were closer to her than she had ever imagined. I didn't know, she murmured, as if that could justify what she had done, as if those words could erase her cruelty and indifference. I didn't know who she was. But inside herself, she knew that this knowledge would change nothing, that her coldness and contempt would not disappear even if she knew the truth. After the lawyer left, the woman stood in silence, absorbed in the shock of what she had heard. The news that the girl's father was her ex-husband, Mr. Barkley, echoed in her mind, forcing her to look at what had happened from a different perspective. She tried to process the information, but instead, her mind was overtaken by the painful memories from the past that she had been running away from for so long. The memories that she had tried to suppress as distant and insignificant were now surfacing in her mind, bringing to life images of her once tumultuous life with Mr. Barkley. Her marriage to him, though prestigious and promising a beautiful life, was far from perfect. At the beginning of their relationship, he had been full of charm, attraction, even generosity. His heart was open to people regardless of their position or background, and this sometimes caused her irritation mixed with envy. She, being a reserved and strict person, did not share his approach to life, considering him too soft. Over time, this softness became for her a symbol of weakness and something alien, something that did not fit into her strict vision of life. She remembered how their differences had grown with each passing year, how her conviction of her own superiority and her desire to subjugate him to her world had led to a cold estrangement between them. It seemed to her that he would have to change his views in time and fit in completely with her, but he remained true to his principles, his ideas about justice and humanity. He was painfully aware of her bias, her rigidity, but in time he stopped trying to explain to her why her cold and arrogant outlook on life was destroying their marriage. She remembered those long evenings when no word had been spoken between them, and the heaviness with which they had parted. He had gone away with his dignity and calm, and she had stayed, convinced that she had gotten rid of her weakness, that now, at last, she would be able to live the life she thought was right. But the years passed, and she was left alone in her perfect but empty house. She had chosen the path of loneliness, surrounding herself with things that emphasized her status but brought her no joy. Now, remembering those moments, the woman realized how deeply wrong she had been, how the contempt she felt for those she considered outsiders in her world had turned against her. Her arrogance and desire for control, her judgment and intransigence toward people who didn't meet her standards had ruined her life, and she hadn't even realized it. With each new thought, her heart shrank with pain and regret, as if the weight of her wrong decisions, her cold arrogance, had suddenly fallen on her. She began to see how she had been living in an illusion, imagining that her world was protected and stable as long as it remained clean of anything that didn't fit within her narrow confines. But now that the truth was revealed, she realized that her world was actually fragile and empty. Her confidence and complacency had been built on sand, and now that sand was crumbling away, leaving only emptiness and bitterness. The woman pictured again the girl's face, her frightened eyes, her trembling hands as she asked for help. And with that image came the memory of Mr. Barkley, of his kind heart, of his ability to see the good in people, no matter what their position or appearance. She suddenly remembered the words he had spoken on their last meeting as they parted. "One day," he had said, "your heart will be a prison, and you will be alone. And then you'll have to remember that nothing in the world is more important than simple compassion. She had only grinned at his words then, thinking them weakness. But now they pierced her like a revelation. She realized that the prison of which Mr. Barkley spoke was her own soul, cold and closed, unable to see or feel anything but her own world. Her conviction that she was right had turned out to mean that she was now alone, deprived of that human warmth which, she realized too late, was the true richness of life. These realizations came upon her with an unbearable weight. She realized that the girl standing on her doorstep was not merely a stranger's child, but a part of her own past, her own history. And her coldness, her indifference to the girl, was a reflection of the contempt she felt for Mr. Barkley, the man who had once been her husband and who, in spite of their differences, had tried to teach her compassion. The woman's heart felt true remorse for the first time, but with it came the realization of how late that remorse had come. She began to realize that the years of her life spent isolated from people and their pain had been empty and meaningless. Her scorn and pride had robbed her of the opportunity to be a part of something bigger, a part of other people's lives. And this little girl she had kicked out was her last chance for redemption, but now her act could no longer be undone. Deep down, she realized that the moment she closed the door to the child, she had finally and irrevocably closed the door to her own salvation. The woman sat in her empty house, surrounded by a cold, silent splendor that suddenly seemed utterly alien and meaningless to her. Before, the walls, the paintings, the expensive things had given her life a sense of order and certainty. But now, they were as impersonal and cold as her own heart. Her gaze wandered about the room, finding no comfort in anything. And the image of that girl, her trembling hands, her large eyes full of fear and pleading, came back to her mind again and again. For the first time in a long time, the woman felt something painful and agonizing in her heart, a deep, piercing sense of shame. Shame was something new and unfamiliar to her, a feeling she had long considered a weakness unworthy of her character. She was used to thinking herself above it all, above any emotion that made a man doubt his actions. But now, her mind was sinking into the tight, visceral darkness of the realization that she had not merely acted cruelly, she had done so in the belief that she had the right to judge other people by superficial traits that had nothing to do with their inner selves. Scenes that had seemed right and justified to her before began to surface in her mind. She remembered how all her life she had looked with arrogant confidence at people who, in her opinion, did not meet her standards. In every situation, she opted for cruelty and indifference, believing it to be a sign of strength. Her prejudiced views of people, her habit of judging others by their background, status, or appearance, all of it now seemed painfully wrong and ugly to her. These thoughts came in waves, stronger each time, robbing her of her last peace of mind and plunging her into an abyss of self-criticism. She remembered the days of her marriage to Mr. Barkley, his tolerance and kindness, which had once seemed to her a sign of weakness. He had not shared her rigid views of life and people, and his heart had always been open, ready to help anyone who needed support. She, on the other hand, saw this as his weakness, convinced that his empathy for people was what made him vulnerable and soft. With each passing day, she drifted further away from him, not realizing that his true strength lay precisely in his compassion and ability to help without judging. Now that he was no longer in her life, she realized how deeply wrong she had been. She realized that her coldness and cruelty had not made her strong, but had instead alienated her from people, made her lonely and empty. Her world was built on contempt and isolation, and in this world there was no room for love, for true human intimacy. She realized that even if the girl had not been her ex-husband's daughter, her act would still have been unforgivable because she had rejected a person in need of help because of her superficial, narrow-minded beliefs. With each passing moment, this realization deepened, penetrating her mind like a red-hot knife plunging into a wound. She realized that her prejudice had robbed her of something important, the opportunity to be a real person, capable of kindness and generosity. She began to remember other times in her life when her indifference and coldness had hurt people close to her. She recalled quarrels with her family, disdain for co-workers who she felt were beneath her, aloofness from friends who asked for her support. All of this she had once considered a sign of strength, not realizing that her strength was actually a manifestation of cruelty and weakness. The sense of shame crept deeper into her heart, revealing to her the impartial truth she had denied for so long. Her arrogance, her contempt for others, was not a sign of strength, but a wall she had built around herself to avoid vulnerability, to keep out anyone who might make her doubt herself. Now, realizing this, she felt as if she had been exposed, as if her soul had been laid bare to herself, stripped of all defenses. Every thought of the girl, every picture that popped into her head caused her acute pain. She saw the picture before her, a lonely child on her doorstep, a child she had thrown out into the street without giving her a chance. Her act no longer seemed righteous to her. It seemed horrible, cruel, and unjust. Her preconceived notions that had given her an illusory sense of certainty and righteousness were now turning against her, making her realize how blind and ruthless she had been. The shame that gripped her heart gradually turned into deep remorse. She realized that she had lost something important, that her life might never be able to return to its former state. Her realization was heavy and agonizing, like a long awakening from a long dream in which she was sure she was right. Her illusion shattered, revealing the emptiness that had always been inside her, but which she had been unwilling to recognize. It had been hours since the lawyer had left her house, but the words he had spoken seemed to linger in her mind. She wandered through the rooms, slowly and without purpose, trying to comprehend not only the act she had committed, but what that act said about herself. It seemed that the walls of her own home, where she had felt safe and secure for so many years, were now pressing in on her, becoming cold and alien. In every object, in every mirror, she saw a reflection of her cruelty, her selfishness, and, worst of all, her inability to show mercy to those who needed help. Her mind kept returning to the face of the girl she had thrown out. That small, trembling figure, sitting in the darkness of the night, trying to find a little warmth in a world full of indifference and hatred, did not let her rest. The woman was beginning to realize that what she had done was more than a mistake. It was a betrayal of the very human principles her own family had once taught her, the very principles she had so vehemently rejected. She realized that this girl was not just her ex-husband's child, but a symbol of her own lost kindness, of compassion, of a quality she might once have had, but which had long since disappeared in the swirl of her prejudice and judgment. For the first time in her life, she felt she had to make a change. She realized that she could not go on like this, that if she left things as they were, she would never be able to rid herself of the guilt that now lodged itself in her heart. Her act had been a painful revelation to her. She saw herself as a monster, cruel and cold, incapable of compassion. The thought of it made her despair, and she realized that the only way to ease the pain was to try to atone for it. The woman stopped at the window and looked out at the street where the girl had once stood, shivering with cold and fear. She remembered her words, her rudeness, how she had literally pushed her out the door, as if she were not a living being, but something unnecessary and alien. She was afraid and ashamed to even think that this girl might still be on the street somewhere, still in need of the help and warmth she had so cruelly denied her. Now her heart was burning with the desire to find the girl, to give her the helping hand she had rejected when she needed it. She realized that it might not be easy, that the girl might not forgive her or accept her care, but she had to at least try. She wanted to apologize, to do for this girl what she should have done all along, show warmth and care. But the agonizing thoughts came into her mind again and again. How? How can I atone for what I've done? How can I earn her forgiveness? The woman realized that simply apologizing would not be enough. She pondered how to find her, how to help not only her, but all those she had rejected and despised for so long. A deep sense of responsibility swept over her, not only for her act, but for everything she had once considered unimportant. She realized for the first time that true strength and greatness did not lie in arrogance and judgment, but in the ability to help in spite of prejudice and fear. Remembering her ex-husband's face, his kind and gentle gaze, she realized that he had always known this truth, but had never been able to convey it to her. He had tried to teach her compassion, patience, but she had proudly rejected his lessons, thinking herself superior. Now, looking back, she saw how right he had been, and that realization filled her with even more regret. She realized that she had a long way to go to try to become the person he saw in her, the person she could have seen in herself if she hadn't abandoned humanity for vain pride. Now a longing for redemption had awakened in her that she knew would be long and difficult. She wanted not just to find the girl, but to change something in herself. Her prejudice, her cruelty, her narrow view of the world all seemed disgusting and wrong to her now. She could no longer live in her old worldview, where people were just objects to be judged and rejected. The woman sat down at her desk, took out paper and pen to write to her lawyer and ask him to help her find the girl. She planned to offer her everything she had: a home, care, support, a chance to learn and grow up warm and safe. She realized that this girl might never be able to forgive her for the horror she had endured, but the woman had to try anyway. She knew she had a journey ahead of her, full of hardship and perhaps rejection, but there was hope in her heart that one day she could become a person capable of true kindness and compassion. Her desire to right her wrongs became her new purpose, a bright light in a dark world she had created for herself. The woman slowly put the letter into the envelope, wrote the lawyer's name on it, and set it aside on the edge of the table, feeling that she had taken the first step. For the first time in a long time, her heart was not empty, but filled with a sincere desire to help, and this new feeling, though painful, brought her some peace. She knew there was a long road to redemption ahead, but she was willing to take it. At first light, barely able to catch her breath after a night of agonizing thoughts and remorse, the woman decided that she could no longer stay in her house in the cold and silence. She knew that if she did not act, this inner pain, this acute sense of guilt would only grow, poisoning every moment of her existence. She couldn't afford to wait a day, not even an hour. She had to find the girl and do everything she could to atone for her cruelty. She found the lawyer who had come the day before and begged him to help her find the girl. The man was surprised at her persistence, and his gaze remained cool and even a little contemptuous. He didn't seem to have much faith in her remorse, suspecting that it was just an impulse of fleeting guilt. But seeing her determination, he finally agreed and promised to give her contacts of social workers and shelters where the girl could go. The woman grasped this tiny chance like a lifeline, hoping that at least one of these threads would lead her to the one she had once so inhumanely rejected. The search took several days. She went to shelters and hospices, to volunteers and passers-by, to those who might know something about the girl lost in the big city. Every time she was told that the girl had not been seen or was unknown, her heart clenched. She feared that perhaps the girl had been left on the streets, or worse, had stumbled upon someone who would do her harm. With each blank answer, her fear grew, turning into an almost unbearable sense of hopelessness. The woman felt that her world was crumbling completely and irrevocably. The thought that the girl might have been hurt because of her poisoned her mind. Over and over again, she pictured that small, lonely figure wandering the streets, trying to find shelter, and the image tore at her heart. She could not forgive herself for the indifference with which she had rejected the child, and now, wandering through the streets, she felt in her heart all the pain she had so easily inflicted on others. Every evening she returned home, but found no peace there. The image of the girl, her plea for help, and the fear with which she stood on the doorstep came back to her mind again and again. These memories were unbearable. They became a constant nightmare from which there was no escape. One night, feeling utterly desperate, she could not stay at home any longer and went out into the street again, hoping that someone would show her the way, show her where the girl might be. She contacted the social services that sometimes help children on the street and left her details, begging the staff to let her know immediately if they knew anything. She realized that this journey could take a long time, but she was willing to go all the way. Her soul was filled with despair, but with it a faint hope that she would still have a chance to make amends. Finally, after long, exhausting days of searching, one of the social workers contacted her. The girl had been found in one of the city's shelters. She had gotten there after being seen on the street late at night and decided to help. Notified of this, the woman rushed to the shelter, her heart pounding as if ready to burst out of her chest and her mind consumed with fear and excitement. She didn't know if the girl would accept her apology, if she could forgive her for her pain, but she knew it was her only chance. When she arrived at the orphanage, she stopped in front of the door, feeling fear paralyzing her. She stood hesitating to enter, realizing that now she would have to look into the girl's eyes and confess her guilt. She stood at the door for a long time, trying to gather her thoughts, and finally she gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and entered. She was led into a small room where the girl was sitting on an old armchair. Her face still bore the imprint of fear and distrust. Her eyes, usually lively and hopeful, now seemed faded, and her body was tight, as if she were trying to hide even in this safe place. The girl had not expected to see the woman who had treated her so cruelly. She looked at her with bewilderment, mixed with anxiety, and clutched her old toy in her hands, as if it was the only thing that made her feel safe. The woman came closer, stopped in front of her, and tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. She felt that any word she said might not be enough, that no apology could erase the pain she had caused this child. But despite that, she had to try. "I'm sorry." Her voice trembled, and she looked into the girl's eyes, hoping she would understand the depth of her remorse. "I did a terrible thing. No, worse than terrible. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I regret every word and action I've ever taken." The girl looked at her, not knowing what to say. Her little heart remembered all the insults, fear, and pain she had experienced. But there was something in the woman's eyes that made her think. It was a sincere remorse she hadn't expected to see. The woman continued, barely holding back her tears. "I made a mistake, a big mistake. And you shouldn't have suffered because of my indifference and cruelty. I would do anything to make it up to you if you would let me." With these words, she knelt down in front of the girl as if she needed her forgiveness, as if forgiveness was the only thing that could give her peace. Her eyes filled with tears that she could no longer hold back, and the girl saw that her pain was real, that the woman was truly sorry for what she had done. After a long pause, the girl though she didn't say a word, nodded slightly. The woman realized that this was the beginning, the first step, a small but important sign that the girl was ready to, at least, try to forgive. Time passed slowly, and every moment seemed like an eternity to the woman. When she saw that the girl nodded faintly in response to her apology, her heart filled for a moment with timid hope. But the woman realized that this was only the first step, tiny, but so valuable. She knew that their journey ahead would be long, full of trials and difficult conversations. The girl's eyes were still painful, and her gaze was wary, a wariness like an invisible barrier separating her from the woman, preventing her from fully believing in the sincerity of her remorse. They sat opposite each other in the small room of the shelter, and their silence was tense, like a taut string. The woman didn't know where to begin, how to choose words to reduce the heavy distance between them. Her usual ways of communicating, her confidence, her control over the situation. It all seemed out of place here, weak and useless. Now she didn't need to appear strong or right. On the contrary, she needed to show her vulnerability, her desire to undo what she had done, and perhaps even her willingness to suffer for it. The woman drew in her breath and said softly, "I realize that words can't make up for what I did. I don't think anything can truly make up for the harm I did to you, and I can't imagine what it was like for you that night." Her voice shook, and she fell silent, feeling the bitter pain in her soul. "I'm not asking you to forget, but I want to at least try to earn your forgiveness." The girl looked at her warily, her small body still tense. She was silent, but there was a spark of curiosity mixed with suspicion in her eyes. The woman saw it and realized that she was not just a child, but a person who had been traumatized, for whom trust was something almost impossible after the pain she had experienced. "You know," the woman said, trying to be as honest as possible, "for a long time I lived my life the way I thought was right. I thought I could judge people by their appearance, by their position. I believed I had the right to decide who was worthy of my time and attention. And I was wrong. Your father—" She hesitated, not knowing how to continue. "He always knew the importance of kindness. He tried to teach it to me, but I rejected his lessons." With each word, she was getting harder and harder, for these confessions were painful, devastating to her. She was revealing her faults to the girl, admitting her weaknesses, her cruelty, her inability to be human. She didn't expect the child to understand this, but she felt it was necessary. It was the only way to redeem herself. The girl, still silent, looked at her, her small hands folded in her lap, and her gaze remained shrewd and a little distrustful. Her childish heart was too wounded, too frightened to open up at once, and she did not know whether this woman could be trusted. She could see that she was remorseful, but was that enough? Would she be able to forgive her? These questions plagued her, and their complexity weighed heavily on her fragile shoulders. The woman continued, noticing that the girl was listening to her, even if outwardly not showing her emotions. "I want you to know, if you ever decide to give me a chance, I will do everything I can to help you. I can't change what was, but I can be there for you." Her voice softened and she held out her hand, but when she noticed the girl recoil, she took it away. "I understand. You don't have to believe me, but I'll wait and help you in any way I can, if you need it." The girl looked away, her gaze falling to the floor, where she could see a small pattern on the linoleum. She seemed absorbed in her thoughts, her face serious and a little pensive. She did not know what to answer. On the one hand, there was a desire, deeply hidden and unrecognized, to feel the warmth and protection she so desperately lacked. On the other hand, the fear of betrayal and pain was too strong. They continued to sit opposite each other, and it was as if time had stopped. The woman didn't rush her, realizing that the girl had to come to any decision on her own, that anything she said now could only hurt her. She simply stayed by her side, letting the girl decide for herself what she wanted to do, ready to wait as long as necessary. Finally, after many minutes of silence, the girl raised her head and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "I was scared. I didn't understand why you did this to me. And I was in a lot of pain." Those words hit the woman harder than any accusation. She felt that she had no right to justify herself, that any answer, any explanation would be pointless and inappropriate. She only nodded, showing that she understood. She remained silent so that the girl could continue if she wished. "I can't believe you want to help me now," the girl continued, her voice still timid and shaky. "But I'd like to try." Those words were like a breath of fresh air to the woman. She felt that despite all the pain she had caused, the girl had given her a tiny chance, a spark of hope that their story could be different. She didn't know how their journey would turn out, but she was willing to do her best to rebuild trust, to give the girl the care and support she had denied her before. The woman smiled, but her smile was not only one of relief, but also of recognition of the responsibility she had taken on. Now she had to do her best to justify the girl's trust, to prove to her that her forgiveness was not just words, but the beginning of a new journey. Over the next few days, the girl and the woman met more and more often. They spent time in the humble garden of the orphanage or sat in the shade of the big old trees, sometimes exchanging words, sometimes just being side by side in silence. These moments were both warm and tense at the same time, as if each of them hid anticipation and anxiety. The girl was withdrawn, her childish heart frightened, and every time she looked at the woman who was now trying to be kind and caring, a complex struggle of feelings arose within her. Should she forgive her or reject her forever? The decision seemed too difficult for her small but traumatized soul. Every day the girl noticed how hard the woman was trying. She brought books and small gifts, treated her to fruits she liked. The woman did her best to make the girl feel her sincerity, to earn her trust little by little. But despite all these attempts, the girl felt that she was still scared. There was something about it that she couldn't understand. Why she still felt this prickling pain, this anxiety that wouldn't leave her. She felt that perhaps all this was nothing more than a beautiful screen, that one day the woman would show her true face again, and that face would be cold and merciless. Every night the girl wondered if she would ever be able to truly trust her. She remembered the day she had been rudely kicked out of the door, that night full of fear and despair, and she thought it was impossible to forgive. But when she looked at the woman now, when she saw her face softened with remorse, her eyes full of pain and regret, she couldn't help but feel that the woman had really changed, that rudeness and cruelty no longer reflected who she was. One day, sitting next to a woman on a bench, the girl, gathering her courage, spoke. "Why have you changed so much? Why do you want to help me now? You didn't care about me before." The woman listened to her carefully and then slowly exhaled and answered, choosing her words with care. Before, I used to think that I knew who was worthy of help and who wasn't. I lived in my own little world where I thought only of myself and my rules. But then, after the night I left you alone, I realized I was sorely mistaken. I saw how unfair I'd been and how much pain I'd caused you. You didn't deserve that. You deserved help and warmth and support. And now, if you'll let me, I want to give you back at least a little of what I took from you. The girl was silent, but her eyes were full of emotion. She listened to the woman's words and her heart beat faster. She saw in front of her not the arrogant, cold woman she had once met. This woman had truly changed. There was sincerity in her voice, her eyes glowing with redemption. But the girl still couldn't make up her mind. Fear stayed with her, not giving her the assurance that she would not be abandoned again, that she would not be betrayed again. A couple of days later, as they sat in the garden again, the woman asked her cautiously, "How are you feeling? I realize we've had a rough history, but if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here for you." These words made the girl think. She had been alone for a long time, with no one to discuss her fears and pain with. But now she had someone who listened to her, who didn't turn away, who didn't reject her. And though the pain wasn't gone yet, she felt that maybe this was a chance for a fresh start. But how could she be sure this man wouldn't hurt her again? One night the girl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about forgiveness again. Forgiveness meant opening her heart, letting herself trust again. But what if she was rejected again? She didn't know if she had the strength to go through it again. Her little heart knew to forgive meant taking a huge risk. It seemed to her that her test was not revenge or resentment, but the process of acceptance itself, letting go of past pain, accepting the apology, and trusting the woman who had hurt her so much. The next day they met again in the garden, and the girl, after hesitating, at last ventured to speak. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely. I'm still hurt. And I'm afraid that if I trust you again, you might hurt me even more." When the woman heard this, she felt something inside her shiver. She nodded, not looking away, and answered quietly, "I understand. You don't have to forgive me right away, and you may never be able to forgive me completely. But if I can be there for you, if I can help and care for you, if it eases your pain even a little bit, that's a lot for me." These words surprised the girl. She expected that the woman would ask for her forgiveness, that she would persuade her to forget the old offense. But instead, she saw the woman accept her feelings without trying to change them. It was something new, unexpected. She felt that for the first time her pain was being acknowledged, that her fears and wounds were understood and not considered wrong or unnecessary. After a long pause, the girl, struggling to choose her words, said, "I don't know what will happen next, but I guess I want to try. I want to see if I can trust you." These words were like a light at the end of a long, painful journey. She realized that the girl's trust was still fragile, that her pain was still too fresh, but it was a beginning. The woman was ready to wait, to take small steps, to confirm her remorse not with words but with actions, so that the girl could see that her intentions were sincere. They looked at each other, and there was something new in that look, a thin, almost intangible thread of trust that gradually began to bind them together. For the woman, it was a chance not just to redeem herself, but to realize that love and kindness do not require instant forgiveness. And for the girl, it was the beginning of a journey where she could finally find the protection and peace she had been missing. The woman was returning home from her meeting with the girl, and there was a strange mixture of relief and inexpressible heaviness in her soul. Although the girl had cautiously indicated that she was willing to try to trust her, the woman realized that the road to her forgiveness and true redemption would be long and thorny. That path, she realized, was not only between her and the girl, but between her and the world itself, which now saw her very differently. Her act, her coldness, and the cruelty with which she had once thrown the girl out of the door did not go unnoticed. Rumors spread quickly through the city. People began to discuss her, to talk about the night she had left the helpless child on the street. At first, the woman thought it was just gossip, that everything would soon subside, but as time went on, she began to notice the cold stares of her neighbors, the contemptuous whispers behind her back that seemed to accompany her everywhere. Her deed became known, and her reputation, previously spotless and almost perfect, was cracking at the seams. What she had once considered inviolable, the respect and admiration of the people around her, was now crumbling like a house of cards. Now, when she walked the streets or went into stores, she could feel the judgmental stares. She heard people whispering quietly that not even the children were spared, that she was soulless. And these words were eating her up inside. Her social circle, which had previously admired her austerity and confidence, began to drift away. People who had once sought to be near her now avoided her. Invitations to evenings and dinners she had once enjoyed dried up. Finding herself isolated, the woman experienced for the first time the same rejection and loneliness she had once made the girl experience. Every day she felt more and more acutely the gravity of the consequences of her act. It was not just a public condemnation, it was an awakening of her own conscience, of her own attitude toward herself. She began to see herself through the eyes of others, and the sight was painful and humiliating. She used to pride herself on her independence and correctness, believing that she lived by strict moral principles that allowed her to look down on others. Now she realized how limited her world was, how narrowly she perceived the people around her. She realized that her position in society, her perfect reputation, was just a facade that hid her inner emptiness and fear. This whole world built on arrogance and judgment was fragile and unreliable. Her old attitudes and values no longer gave her satisfaction. She felt the loneliness enveloping her, and for the first time she began to truly understand what it meant to be rejected. This rejection was a powerful lesson for her, and she began to realize that only sincere remorse and a desire to change herself could restore some of her inner peace. Now she tried to make up for her mistakes by participating in the orphanage's activities, helping children to whom she had not previously paid the slightest bit of attention. She spent her evenings reading books on parenting, psychology, childcare, trying to understand how she could better help the girl, how to earn her trust. But even here she had to face resentment and doubt. The social workers and staff at the shelter saw her efforts, but they also knew what she had done and, as it turned out, were not ready to welcome her with open arms. Every step she took, every attempt to help, provoked questions and latent hostility, as if no one wanted to believe she could change. They saw her not as a person seeking redemption, but as a woman trying to get rid of her guilt, and this attitude was a real test for her. Even her family was wary of her. Her relatives, who had previously admired her successful life and strong character, now viewed her with suspicion. Her sister, with whom she had always maintained a warm relationship, coldly remarked in one conversation, "I never thought you were capable of such a thing. How could you?" These words, spoken with pain and disappointment, hurt her, showing how far she had gone in her selfishness and indifference. The woman was forced to face the destruction of her former relationships, to realize that people no longer saw her as the person she once wanted to be. Her former life of respect and admiration was behind her. Her home, which had once seemed like a refuge, was now empty and silent, and in that silence echoed her mistakes, her cruel decisions. However, despite the pain, despite the rejection and the cold stares, the woman continued her quest for redemption. She realized that true forgiveness was not a path that could be taken quickly and easily. She realized that her life might never be the same again, that her reputation, her name, her place in society were all forever changed. But along with that realization came a sense of inner freedom that she had never experienced before. Every day she began to see that external opinion, social status, and the approval of others are only a shell that does not matter if there is no true understanding and love inside. She realized that her life would never be the same again, that the path to redemption is a long and difficult process that requires not only effort, but also patience and a sincere desire to help others. And although she was afraid and in pain, she accepted this path, realizing that it was through trials, through sacrifice and hardship that she could finally find the peace she had been missing for so long. She lived differently now. Her home, her heart, her soul, all of it had changed. Her former pride and arrogance were gone, giving way to humility and compassion. And though each new day reminded her of who she was, the woman felt that this journey of hardship was leading her to something deeper and more meaningful than all the accomplishments she had once been proud of. The woman stood on the threshold of her house, breathing in the fresh morning air that filled her body and mind with unexpected peace. Ahead of her was another day full of challenges that promised to be as difficult as every day since her life had changed. She realized that the path of redemption she had chosen would be long and difficult, and that she might have to carry the burden of her mistakes for the rest of her life. But now, with each new thought, with each step, she felt ready to accept that burden, realizing that it had become a part of herself. Many weeks after that first meeting, when the girl had given her a chance, she began to notice a slight change in their relationship. The girl was still reserved, but her wariness and distrust were gradually giving way to curiosity and quiet affection. Sometimes they walked together in the park or sat in the garden, discussing books they had read or simple everyday things. The woman tried to be close and supportive, giving the girl space and time to heal from her pain. This experience changed her. Each new day became a lesson in patience and mindfulness. She realized how important it is to let other people be who they are, to respect their boundaries, not to impose their desires. The girl taught her this silently, without words, simply through her presence, through her childhood joys and sadnesses, which the woman learned to accept with deep, almost maternal care. But the imprint of her past always stayed with her, a reminder of the kind of person she was, how easily she could hurt others and how rash her actions were. She knew that this burden would stay with her forever, that even if the girl forgave her completely, she would not be able to forget the pain she had caused. But now it didn't seem so heavy. It was part of her story, something that gave her life new meaning. She realized that she couldn't change her past, but now that knowledge no longer depressed her. On the contrary, she accepted it as part of her journey, as something that, despite its dark nature, gave her a chance to become a better person. This realization filled her with a strength she had never known before. Now she saw before her the road not to correct her mistakes, but to create a new life, full of attention, care, and sincerity. One such day, as they sat together on a bench in the garden, the girl suddenly spoke softly. "You know, I think that maybe we can try to be friends." These words, simple and yet filled with deep meaning, penetrated the woman's heart like a ray of light. She understood how much effort this confession had cost the girl, and tears welled up in her eyes. She nodded silently, holding back the storm of emotions, and answered, "I would be honored. I can never thank you enough for this." They sat in silence, and in that silence there was more than could be expressed in words. It was a moment of acceptance and forgiveness, a thin thread of trust that bound them together and allowed them both to begin a new chapter, not rejecting the pain of the past, but recognizing it and turning it into a source of strength. The woman felt her life had changed, not just for redemption, but to learn to be truly alive and open. She no longer needed social acceptance, an impeccable reputation, or outward perfection. Her heart was filled with the realization that what mattered most was honesty and sincerity, which she now valued above all else. This new chapter of her life did not promise ease, but it was full of significance. She knew that she would have to work on herself for a long time, to be patient and attentive. But now, there was room in her soul for real kindness, room for those she couldn't or wouldn't understand before. The story of her redemption was just beginning, but in that beginning was the hope and peace she had always lacked. Friends, thank you for watching this story to the end. We want to know your opinion. How do you feel about this story? Have there been times in your life when you've had to face bias or see it from the outside? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your words, your experiences are what make our channel alive and real. Each of you is very important to us, and we truly appreciate that you choose to be with us, share your thoughts, and support our project. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the new stories we have in store for you. We wish you a beautiful, bright day. Be kind to yourself and others.